All right, ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Today, we're tackling Boy Power, this guidebook for young men going through puberty. And let me tell you, it's got some interesting metaphors right from the get-go.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, they compare puberty to going from a playground to a sports field. What do you think? Is that analogy spot on or a bit of a stretch?
That's a vivid comparison. I can see where they're going with that.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. On a playground, everything's kind of fluid.
Right.
Kids just doing their thing, no real structure.
Exactly. Just pure, unadulterated fun.
Right. But then you step onto that sports field, and suddenly there's competition. There are rules, strategies, pressure to perform.
Yeah.
And the book saying puberty brings that same kind of shift, especially for guys.
Yeah, it's like you suddenly realize there's a scoreboard and everyone's got their eyes on the prize. And speaking of realizing things, I gotta say, I was kind of surprised by how much detail they go into about the physical changes of puberty.
Yeah, it's pretty up close and personal.
It is, like voice cracking, awkward growth spurts. They even talk about feeling like your limbs are 5 steps ahead of your torso. Made me wonder, can all those physical changes really explain the emotional roller coaster teenagers go through? Or is there more to it?
It's tempting to connect the dots, right? Hormones going haywire, emotions doing the same, got to be a link there. And to be fair, the book does lean heavily on the whole testosterone thing.
Yeah, it's the go-to explanation, isn't it?
It is. But, like we both know, it's way more complicated than that. While those hormones are doing their thing, the brain's also going through a major growth spurt during adolescence. And then you add in social pressures, expectations, the whole shebang.
It's like trying to hit a moving target while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. Everything feels a little off.
Perfectly put. And that's exactly why it's so important to remember those feelings are valid. It's not just hormones, not just you. It's this crazy mix of biology and society all happening at once.
So it's like a perfect storm.
Exactly. And honestly, I think acknowledging that complexity is one of the book's strong points.
No, the book doesn't just focus on the physical stuff. There's a whole chunk on the emotional side of puberty, too.
Right, because that's a whole other ballgame.
Totally. Yeah. Though, I gotta say, some of its takes on girls felt kind of outdated.
Oh? How so?
Well, there's a lot of that boys will be boys and girls are from Venus kind of stuff.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it did get me thinking, how much of the emotional roller coaster of puberty is universal and how much is shaped by, the culture we grow up in? What do you think?
That's a great question. It's easy to get caught up in all the cultural narratives around gender and puberty, but yes, some experiences are definitely universal.
For sure.
Like the book talks about learning to deal with rejection. That's something everyone goes through, no matter who you are or where you come from.
Oh, tell me about it. I remember those early rejections. Felt like the end of the world.
Right.
Totally. Speaking of navigating those intense emotions, there's this whole section on managing anger, frustration, all those big feelings that kind of pop up out of nowhere during puberty.
It's like someone flipped a switch.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And they encourage boys to become like keen observers of themselves, their reactions, almost like their own science experiment. Do you think that kind of self-awareness is even teachable at that age?
That's a tough one. It can be tricky, but I think it's possible. The key is framing it the right way, instead of making it about controlling your emotions, which can feel impossible to a teenager.
Yeah, especially when it feels like your emotions are controlling you.
Exactly. The book focuses on understanding the why behind those feelings. Like, what are the triggers? What's happening in your body when you're angry or frustrated? Once you start to see those patterns, it gives you a little breathing room to make different choices.
It's like hitting the pause button before reacting, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that ties into another big thing the book explores, finding that balance between needing independence from your parents, but still wanting that connection.
Oh, it's such a push and pull, isn't it? It's like you're trying to chart your own course, but you still want that safety net.
Absolutely. And that's why communication is so important during those years.
Oh, for sure.
It's easy for teenagers and parents to kind of retreat into their own corners, but keeping that dialogue open, even when it's tough.
Because it's not always pretty, right?
Definitely not. But the book makes a good point. It's not always about rebelling just to rebel. It's more about young people trying to find their voice, figure out who they are.
All part of the process, right?
Exactly. And that takes practice, trial and error, and maybe a few arguments along the way.
Speaking of finding your place in the world, the book gets into some really specific life advice, and this is where it gets particularly interesting. So we've covered the body changes, the emotional ups and downs, but boy power doesn't stop there. It gets into some pretty practical life advice, and this is where it gets really interesting for me.
Oh, like what?
Well, they've got this whole thing about career success, and they're big on networking, what they call guanxi.
Right, that whole relationship aspect.
Yeah. But it's really rooted in Chinese culture, so I was wondering, how universal is that advice, really? Is guanxi the key no matter where you are, or is there more to it?
It's fascinating, right? Because while the word guangxi might be specific to a certain culture, that idea of building relationships, nurturing them, that's essential for success anywhere, I think.
Yeah, it's that saying, isn't it? It's not always about what you know, but who you know.
Exactly. And the book talks about that back and forth, that mutual benefit in relationships. It's not just taking favors or expecting something, but really cultivating genuine connections.
Because nobody wants to feel used.
Right. Like they're just a stepping stone on someone else's path.
Exactly. Okay, but there's this other piece of advice that caught my eye. This whole thing about seeking out challenges, embracing adventure. The book kind of romanticizes this idea of travel, pushing your limits, especially for young men. And while I get it, pushing your comfort zone and all that, I also kept thinking, proceed with caution. What do you think? Is there a danger in romanticizing risk too much, especially for young guys who might already be drawn to that thrill-seeking?
Oh, that's such a good point to bring up because while the book definitely focuses on the good stuff about risk-taking, like building resilience, self-discovery, it also says, hey, there are real dangers out there. And I think that's huge. It's knowing the difference between healthy risk-taking, like trying a new sport, pushing yourself in school, and, reckless behavior.
Right. It's about drawing that line, knowing the difference.
Exactly. And that takes time, right? It comes with experience, with having those conversations about consequences. It's not something you learn overnight. But I do like that Boy Power doesn't shy away from that. It acknowledges that pull toward danger, but also emphasizes making smart choices.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Totally.
It's like what we're doing with these deep dives, right? We're looking at these ideas from all sides.
Again, the full picture.
Exactly. And speaking of different angles, got to wrap up with our final thought. And let me tell you, this one stuck with me. We've talked about the physical stuff, the emotional stuff, the whole finding your place thing. But Boy Power ends on a note I didn't expect a section about religion. And it's surprisingly neutral. But what really got me was the whole emphasis on making your own choices, forging your own path. And it made me wonder, how much control do we actually have in shaping our lives? Especially with, how we're raised, our culture, even our biology. It's a lot to unpack, right?
It is. It's that age-old question, isn't it? How much is destiny? How much is free will? And there's no easy answer. But even though our experiences, the environment, they shape us, there's still that human spirit, that drive to figure things out for ourselves, make our own mark.
It's like this push and pull, right? Between what's expected and what we choose.
Exactly. And maybe it's not about finding the perfect answer, but more about, just going through it with all the ups and downs and questions.
It's about asking the big questions, even if we don't have all the answers, right?
Absolutely.
And on that note, folks, we'll leave you to ponder that very question. How much control do you have over your own destiny? It's something to think about as you navigate your own journey. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those deep dives coming.